They didn't wear heavy armor. They didn't charge with swords. And yet, entire armies broke formation at the mere sight of them. From castle sieges to open battlefields, these men could kill you before you even saw them. In the silence before the clash, the sky would darken not from clouds, but from arrows. This is the untold power of the medieval archer and why they were the most feared weapon of war. Before the knight raised his sword or the infantry locked their shields, the battlefield often belonged to a different kind of warrior, one who could kill without ever being seen. The archer stood at the edge of the melee, yet his presence was felt long before the clash. In medieval warfare, this figure altered the psychology of combat, not by brute force, but by calculation, precision, and distance. Archery as a tool of war stretches back centuries, but its role during the Middle Ages changed the dynamics of European conflict. The longbow, in particular, emerged as a defining weapon. Unlike earlier short bows, or even the powerful crossbow, the longbow had both range and rate of fire. An experienced archer could release 6 to 12 arrows per minute, enough to saturate the battlefield with deadly projectiles. It wasn't just about injury, it was about fear, chaotic, paralyzing fear. Horses reared, infantry dropped their weapons. Lines broke before they even engaged. This was especially true during the 100 Years' War, when English archers used the longbow not just as a support weapon, but as a frontline force capable of routing armies. At the Battle of Crécy in Aix-en-Sillel, English archers devastated the French cavalry from behind wooden stakes, proving that even the most elite armored knights were not safe. The same story repeated at Poitiers in 1356 and Agincourt in 1415, where the longbow shattered centuries of military convention. It was no longer the knight who decided battles, it was the man with the bow. The fear wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Arrows fell from the sky with terrifying unpredictability. A man might be killed instantly or left to bleed out slowly. The sound of whistling shafts haunted soldiers long after the battle. And unlike swordplay, which involved honor and visibility, archery was impersonal, distant, and efficient. This bred resentment and fear among traditional warriors. Knights saw archers as cowards, but battlefield results told a different story. Modern myths often downplay the effectiveness of archers. They're shown as support, not as decisive. But in truth, well-trained archers could decimate charging cavalry, cripple siege defenses, and dictate the rhythm of battle. Their dominance wasn't measured in heroic duels, but in broken formations, abandoned charges, and battlefield panic. Archers blurred the line between combat and strategy. Their presence forced commanders to rethink positioning, timing, and even terrain. They weren't just soldiers, they were battlefield engineers of death. And for those marching toward them, the long shadow of the bow was often the last thing they saw. By the late 13th century, England wasn't just producing archers, it was building them from the ground up. The longbow wasn't a weapon someone could casually learn. It required years of conditioning, training, and relentless repetition, beginning in childhood. Boys as young as 7 were handed a bow nearly as tall as they were. Over time, their backs curved, their shoulders thickened, and their fingers grew callous not by choice, but by national expectation. Under Edward I and his successors, archery training evolved into law. The Assize of Arms and later the Archery Law of 1363 under Edward III mandated that every able-bodied Englishman practice archery on Sundays and holidays. Failure to do so could lead to fines. This wasn't ceremonial, it was a state-sponsored campaigned to produce a nation of war-ready archers. The government even banned popular sports like football to prevent distractions. Archery wasn't recreation, it was policy. The English longbow typically measured around 6 feet in length and required a draw weight of 100 to 180 pounds. This wasn't something that could be picked up in a few weeks. Drawing that much power demanded years of muscular development. Skeletons recovered from archers at the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's warship, show enlarged shoulder bones and deformed spines, physical evidence of long-term, repetitive strain caused by the longbow. Their bodies were permanently shaped by their weapon. Training emphasized more than strength. Precision mattered. Archers were drilled to shoot accurately over long distances, often 200 to 300 yards. They practiced shooting at the butts, man-made mounds constructed for target practice, which became a familiar sight in English villages. The goal wasn't simply to hit a mark, but to fire rapidly, in volleys, and under pressure. In battle, seconds could separate life from death. In Wales, the tradition was equally fierce. Welsh archers, particularly from Gwent and Glamorgan, had a fearsome reputation well before the English began systematizing longbow training. Gerald of Wales, writing in the 12th century, described Welsh archers as capable of sending arrows through mail armor and even transfixing a man and the horse he rode. Their skill became so renowned that English monarchs began recruiting heavily from Welsh territories in times of war. The cultural weight of archery grew alongside its military value. It became a marker of national identity. While the French leaned on cavalry, England became synonymous with the bowman. Archery was taught in schools, promoted in royal proclamations, and reinforced by local lords. Competitions were held to foster community-wide skill. For many boys, learning to shoot wasn't about glory, it was expected. It was survival. By the 14th century, England had created something few other nations could rival, a deeply embedded archery culture that produced thousands of physically conditioned, battle-ready soldiers. These weren't militia. They were precision-trained professionals. And when they stepped onto the battlefield, they didn't just bring arrows, they brought decades of preparation, state policy, and national pride. The longbow changed everything. Through invention, but through scale, precision, and state-backed integration into warfare. By the early 14th century, it was no longer just a hunter's tool. It had become a battlefield disruptor, with range and power unmatched by anything short of artillery. Constructed primarily from yew, the English longbow could exceed 6 feet in length and launch arrows with a draw weight that often surpassed 150 pounds. In capable hands, it could strike targets over 250 yards away. But it wasn't just the distance, it was what those arrows could do on impact. Bodkin points, narrow and hardened, were designed to pierce armor. When fired en masse, thousands of arrows descending from the sky had the potential to puncture mail, pierce through visors, and tear through leather gambesons. At closer range, even plate armor could fail. The longbow wasn't the first projectile, the weapon of the medieval era, but it was the most efficient. The crossbow, by comparison, required less training but had a slower rate of fire, typically 2 or 3 bolts per minute, with less reach. It also relied on mechanical aids like windlasses or cranks to reload. Longbowmen, once trained, could release 6 or more arrows in the same span of time, often while repositioning or reacting to commands in real time. This volume of fire made the longbow ideal for volley tactics. Entire units could deliver coordinated salvos designed to saturate advancing formations. Cavalry charges, once the pride of feudal armies, became liabilities against concentrated longbow fire. The power imbalance was especially evident in battles like Crécy-y-Saint-Célil and Poitiers-y-Saint-Semby-Wouchelil, where French knights heavily armored and mounted collapsed under the sheer scale and consistency of English arrow fire. But it was more than just numbers. The longbow changed how commanders approached warfare. Fortified positions no longer offered guaranteed protection. Siege warfare evolved as archers could rain fire from beyond the range of castle defenses. Infantry formations had to adapt, shielding flanks and staggering advances to minimize exposure. The longbow introduced a new kind of control, one that allowed a smaller, strategically placed force to hold ground against larger armies. In economic terms, it also reshaped how war was financed. Knights were expensive. Longbowmen, once trained, were a cost-effective alternative. England invested heavily in cultivating them, and by doing so, redefined its military doctrine. The longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a strategy. Its influence extended beyond England's borders. Other nations, especially France and Scotland, took notice and began adapting their tactics. Some tried to incorporate longbow units, though few matched the scale or discipline of England's trained archers. Others doubled down on armor or relied on mercenaries to counter the threat. But no matter the adjustment, the battlefield had shifted. The longbow ensured that brute strength and noble lineage were no longer guarantees of survival. By the mid-15th century, the longbow had already etched its legacy not as a passing phase, but as a force that restructured medieval warfare from the ground up. Its revolution wasn't just technological, it was strategic, cultural, and enduring. On a medieval battlefield, fear rarely arrived face to face. It came from above, sudden and unannounced. A volley of longbow arrows could travel over 200 yards in seconds, arcing overhead before slamming into men and horses with lethal force. There was no warning, no time to react, only the sound. Chroniclers describe it as a thunderous hiss, followed by a sickening rhythm of impact. For those beneath it, the experience was chaos before the fight had even begun. The psychological impact of longbow fire was immediate and lasting. Unlike melee combat, which involved sightlines, opponents, and a chance to fight back, archers struck invisibly. Soldiers collapsed mid-step. Horses screamed. Command structures disintegrated under panic. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the French cavalry charged into a hail of English arrows. Contemporary accounts describe riders falling before they even reached the enemy's line. The narrow, muddy terrain, combined with relentless volleys, turned the vanguard into a bottleneck of confusion. Knights fell and were trampled by their own men. One French noble, Jean Le Mengre, wrote of seeing the best of France strewn like slaughtered cattle before any sword had been drawn. The noise itself was a weapon. A full volley, thousands of arrows released at once, produced a terrifying sound. Arrows screamed through the air, and those not immediately struck were often wounded by ricochet or trampling. Chronicler Jean Froissart wrote of men pierced through the eye, through the neck, through the leg before they could raise a shield or adjust formation. Panic spread quickly. Infantry broke ranks, either charging recklessly or fleeing altogether. Archers didn't just kill, they shattered cohesion. The most disciplined armies depended on order, lines, flanks, timing. A well-timed barrage could destroy that in seconds. Cavalry, once considered the most fearsome force in medieval warfare, proved especially vulnerable. Horses, unlike men, didn't respond to commands under pain. When terrified, they bolted, Riders were unseated or dragged. Formations turned inward, blocking their own retreat. The aftermath of such attacks was often described with horror. Battlefield excavations near Visby and Totan, though involving different periods and weapons, reveal soldiers killed while still in formation, speared, crushed, or shot from afar. Arrows embedded in skulls, necks, and pelvises tell of soldiers who never reached the fight. In some cases, survivors reported retrieving comrades with multiple shafts still lodged in their bodies, some fired from such close range that the arrows had passed through chain mail and bone. English commanders understood this power well. Archery was not just about attrition, it was about psychological dominance. It prepared the battlefield before contact. It demoralized opponents before swords ever crossed. And for those who lived through an arrow storm, the memory often outlasted the battle itself. In an age when courage was currency and hand-to-hand combat was a test of honor, dying unseen from a faceless enemy beyond reach was a terrifying prospect. The longbow didn't just kill, it broke the mind before it broke the body. October 25th, 1415, a muddy field near the village of Agincourt became the graveyard of French nobility and the turning point in the mythology of medieval warfare. The English army, sick, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered, had no reason to expect victory. But what followed was one of the most decisive and humiliating defeats in French military history, delivered not by knights, but by English longbowmen. Henry V's army had been campaigning in France for weeks. After a long siege at Harfleur and a punishing march across northern France, his forces, numbering around 6,000, were reduced, disease-ridden, and cornered by a French army nearly 3 times their size. Estimates placed the French force at over 20,000, heavily composed of mounted knights and armored men at arms. The French believed the English were trapped. What they underestimated was what those archers could do. Henry positioned his men in a narrow strip of farmland between 2 dense woods, Trembled to the north, Agincourt to the south. This terrain neutralized the French numerical advantage. The battlefield, already soaked from days of rain, had turned into thick, clinging mud. Cavalry charges would be slow, infantry movement difficult, and any advance would funnel straight into the center, where Henry's archers waited. Roughly 5,000 longbowmen formed the backbone of the English line. They drove sharpened stakes into the ground to stop cavalry charges and formed a defensive arc that allowed for maximum coverage. When the French launched their assault, they advanced across open ground already reduced to sludge. Horses slipped, knights sank, and formations collapsed into disarray. All the while, volleys of arrows rained down hundreds every few seconds. The arrows didn't need to kill instantly. They wounded, blinded, and unhorsed. They created panic. French charges stalled as men trampled over each other. Those who reached the English line were met not by raw infantry, but archers who dropped their bows and fought with mallets, knives, and axes. The longbowmen weren't merely ranged specialists, they were brutal in close quarters when necessary. That French casualties were staggering. Between 6,000 and 10,000 men were killed, many of them high-ranking nobles, including Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, and Jean de la Mengre, known as Boucicaut. The English lost perhaps a few hundred. The sheer imbalance of losses shocked Europe. One of the most controversial moments came when Henry, fearing a second wave and lacking the manpower to guard his captives, ordered the execution of thousands of French prisoners. This action defied the chivalric norms of the time, but reflected the brutal pragmatism of a king who had just faced annihilation. Agincourt marked the collapse of chivalric warfare as it had been practiced for centuries. It exposed the vulnerability of heavily armored knights against a coordinated force of archers and lightly equipped foot soldiers. The concept of battlefield on a single combat, noble lineage, heavily armored dominance, was shattered by coordinated volleys from peasants with bows. The battle didn't end the 100 Years' War, but it changed how wars were fought, forced military planners to rethink terrain, formations, and class assumptions. It proved that discipline, technology, and positioning could crush nobility and numbers. Agincourt wasn't just a military victory, it was a shift in warfare. The moment when the longbow, already feared, became legendary. Archers were never meant to stand alone. For all their range and killing power, their vulnerability in close combat made their placement on the battlefield a strategic concern. Commanders who relied on them understood that if the enemy reached the line of bows, the advantage was lost. Archers had to be protected, not just with men, but with the terrain itself. Typically, longbowmen were positioned on the flanks or just ahead of the infantry line, but behind physical defenses. In major battles like Agincourt and Crécy, they formed in dense formations, sometimes in a wide arc, allowing them to fire inward toward the center of the enemy advance. The narrowness of these battlefields worked in their favor. Any frontal assault would be forced through a funnel of incoming arrows. With limited ability to maneuver to guard against cavalry, archers drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground, at angles forming a primitive but highly effective anti-horse barrier. These stakes, known as palings or palisades, were positioned in front of the archers and spaced tightly enough to prevent a horse from charging through at full speed. The idea wasn't just to slow cavalry, it was to break the momentum completely. At Crécy in 1346, English archers behind these defences devastated wave after wave of French horsemen, whose advance collapsed in mud and panic before they could reach the front lines. Some battlefields included natural or improvised features to add extra layers of defense. Ditches, pits, and uneven terrain were used to disrupt enemy movement. English forces at Poitiers in 1356 used hedgerows and sunken roads to protect their flanks. These obstacles reduced the effectiveness of both mounted and dismounted attacks, giving archers time to reload and reposition. Archers were never acting alone. Their success depended on coordination with infantry and, when available, dismounted men-at-arms. These heavier troops protected the center and absorbed the brunt of the melee fighting, allowing archers to focus entirely on ranged volleys. The timing of these volleys was critical. A premature release could waste arrows. A delayed volley could mean allowing the enemy to close the distance. Commanders often used visual or audible signals, flags, horns, or shouted orders to synchronize the attack. One key tactical method was the rolling barrage waves of arrows, timed to maintain pressure. As the enemy moved forward, this sustained rhythm of fire not only inflicted casualties, but disrupted formations, sapped morale, and made it nearly impossible for knights or infantry to keep order during the charge. If done well, the battlefield became a controlled kill zone, forcing the enemy into a trap of panic and exhaustion before contact with the English front. Behind the lines, the success of archers rested not only on their own accuracy, but on the system around them. Defensive measures, battlefield positioning, and precise coordination turned what might have been an exposed target into one of the most lethal forces of medieval warfare. Their power was not in isolation. was in the calculated way they were deployed, shielded, and unleashed in 1252. The Statute of Winchester made it clear. The defense of the realm was not just the responsibility of lords and knights, but of every able-bodied freeman. Archery, once a skill of huntsmen and border warriors, became a legal obligation. Englishmen were required by law to keep arms including bows and to train regularly. By the time of Edward III, this duty had intensified. In 1363, royal edicts ordered all men to practice archery on Sundays and feast days, banning other sports that might distract from it. Archery was no longer a pastime, it was national policy. The reason was simple. The longbow had proven itself in Warret Duplin Moor in 1332, at Crécy in Iten-Sambi-Sichelieu, and at Poitiers in 1356. Each victory had shown the tactical advantage of massed archers, and the crown wanted more. A country of trained bowmen was cheaper than hiring foreign mercenaries, and it offered England a standing military advantage over its rivals. But not everyone supported the weapon's rise. The Church, especially in continental Europe, viewed certain projectile weapons as inherently immoral. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council, convened by Pope Innocent II, issued a ban on the use of crossbows and bows against Christians. The ban reflected growing concern that such weapons undermined the chivalric order, allowing commoners to kill nobles from a distance without engaging in personal combat. The crossbow, in particular, was singled out as a weapon of cruelty, capable of piercing armor with ease and used widely by mercenaries. The longbow, however, largely escaped this condemnation, at least in England. It was not a mechanical weapon. It demanded strength, skill, and years of training, and it aligned with the state's interest in mobilizing the lower classes for military service. English kings actively encouraged its use, framing it not as dishonorable, but as patriotic. Archers weren't scorned. They were honored in royal decrees, rewarded after battles, and sometimes given land for their service. The growing reliance on archery also began to shift traditional power structures. Feudal lords had long relied on mounted knights and heavily armored retainers. But after the success of longbow armies, the importance of knightly cavalry diminished. This erosion of the knight's battlefield dominance undermined the prestige of the aristocracy, giving the crown more direct influence over military organization. Archery training was often overseen by local sheriffs or parish officials, extending royal authority into local communities by the late 14th century. The longbow wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a tool of governance. Its practice was enforced. By law, its deployment was central to royal strategy, and its symbolic power, common men defeating noble armies, reshaped the perception of warfare across Europe. While the Church warned against distance killing, and the aristocracy clung to the honor of the sword, England doubled down on the bow. The result was a military system that blurred class lines, reinforced central authority, and built a reputation that would echo through centuries of warfare. By the early 1500s, the sound of war had changed. Arrows gave way to gunpowder, and with it, the longbow, once the dominant weapon of English power, began to fade from the battlefield. Not because it had failed, but because the world around it had shifted. War no longer favored the patient training of the archer. It favored fire, smoke, and the mechanical certainty of the gun. The transition didn't happen overnight. At Flodden Field in 1513, English longbowmen still played a decisive role in defeating the Scottish army. But even then, early firearms, arquebuses, and hand cannons were already making their mark across Europe. Continental armies, especially those of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, began integrating gunpowder weapons into infantry ranks. Unlike the longbow, which required years of practice to master, a firearm could be taught in weeks. Reloading was slower, but it required no exceptional strength, no lifelong muscle conditioning. By the middle of the 16th century, firearms had become standard. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, Spanish arquebusiers routed French cavalry, signaling the end of the night and, by extension, the dominance of projectile weapons like the longbow. Gunpowder weapons were more adaptable to evolving military formations. Pike and shot units replaced the older combinations of bow and bill. Logistics also changed. Armies could be raised and trained faster, outfitted with standardized weapons that didn't rely on generational expertise. The longbow, by contrast, suffered from neglect. The English crown, despite efforts to preserve archery, could not compete with the economic and tactical momentum behind gunpowder. In 1545, the sinking of the Mary Rose, which carried trained longbowmen aboard, marked not just a maritime tragedy but a symbolic turning point. When the ship was recovered centuries later, longbows were found below, dekintact but obsolete. By the end of the 16th century, the longbow had effectively disappeared from English military doctrine. Statutes mandating archery practice remained on the books, but fewer men obeyed them. Even where archery contests were held, they had become more ceremonial than martial. What was lost wasn't just a weapon, it was a system. The longbow represented an age of warfare built on individual discipline, physical conditioning, and years of preparation. Archers weren't simply soldiers, they were a product of state policy, cultural expectation, and national identity. Their disappearance marked the shift toward mass armies, faster mobilization, and an emphasis on volume over skill. Gunpowder brought new possibilities, but also a different kind of warfare, more lethal, less personal, and increasingly dependent on technology. The battlefield no longer belonged to the best trained, belonged to those who could produce and deploy at scale. By the 17th century, the longbow lived on only in memory, literature, and legend. Its legacy was undeniable, but its time had passed. The archer, once feared across Europe, had become a relic in the age of fire. In popular culture, the medieval archer is often reduced to a hooded outlaw, a lone marksman hitting impossible targets with effortless grace. From Robin Hood to modern video games, the longbowman is portrayed as a symbol of rebellion or precision. But these images rarely reflect the historical reality. The truth is more complex and more impressive. Longbowmen were not solitary heroes. They were part of a disciplined system, trained for years, and deployed in coordinated units. In battle, their power didn't come from single shots, but from massed volleys, waves of arrows launched in deadly rhythm. The image of a lone archer taking out a knight from 300 yards simplifies. A weapon that was designed not for accuracy at distance, but for saturation and disruption. There are also enduring myths about the longbow's capabilities. One of the most common is the belief that a single arrow could pierce full plate armor at long range. In truth, longbows were highly effective against male gambesons and unarmored troops. Against the latest plate armor, especially at a distance, their effectiveness dropped significantly. But that wasn't the point. The longbow's value lay in its volume and psychological pressure, its ability to wear down formations, sow panic, and kill horses, not necessarily to pierce the best armor one-on-one. Archers weren't romantic figures in their own time. They were feared, sometimes hated, and often brutal. They looted after battles, fought with knives and mallets when pressed, and received little of the honor reserved for knights. Yet their role in shaping warfare was undeniable. At Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, they altered the outcomes of battles that changed the course of nations. Their legacy is one of preparation and resilience. To become a competent longbowman required more than enthusiasm. It took years of forced practice, physical conditioning, and discipline traits enforced by law in medieval England. The body of a trained archer was physically transformed by the bow. Skeletal remains from the wreck of the Mary Rose show enlarged bones and asymmetrical growth, evidence of the strain the longbow placed on its users. These were not casual soldiers. They were forged by policy and hardened by necessity. More than a military asset, the longbowman represented a shift in how warfare and operated. Victory no longer depended solely on the armored elite. It could come from a mass of common men who had trained not for glory, but for survival. Their presence on the battlefield introduced a new kind of threat, silent, distant, and relentless. Today, the longbow remains a symbol, but not just of marksmanship or folklore. It stands for an era when discipline and preparation reshaped warfare, when fear came not from face-to-face combat, but from the sky, and when a weapon, simple in design but devastating in execution, changed how power was measured on the battlefield.